Hello, it's Adam, not in the Newscast studio, but in a BBC tent at the Hay Literary Festival.
Hello, it's Alex, also in the same said tent at the Hay Festival.
And we're not alone, because there's loads of newscasters sat in the tent with us. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Hello. And also, we'll get to know you in a second, but we've also got some guests on the stage here who are also attending the Hay Festival. Joining us is journalist, author, historian Anne Applebaum. Hello, Anne.
Hi.
And your book is called Autocracy Inc. And I was reading it on the train, rereading it on the train, and it's actually quite scary.
But it's very short.
It's about 200 pages of really scary stuff.
And if you've gone to the end, there's an uplifting ending, sort of.
Yes. Although it is to be continued.
Yes, yeah. Unfortunately, yes.
And we're also joined by Professor David Spiegelhalter from University of Cambridge, who you will have heard on many Radio 4 programmes, like More or Less. Hello, David.
Hi.
And your book is called The Art of Uncertainty.
Yes, and it's very long.
Does it have a happy ending? Who knows?
It
it's uncertain.
Yeah, it is.
But not much art in it.
No,
it's more numbers.
like craft of uncertainty, maybe.
Okay, and we're also joined by a comedian and broadcaster, and he has written a book as well, although it was a few years ago, Marcus Brigstocke. Hello, Marcus.
Hello.
How long is your book?
I have no idea. I've never read it, which means I'm in very good company.
Good stuff. Lovely to see so many friendly faces in the audience as well. We've got some microphones so that if you want to make a comment or ask a question or just say a criticism, we can do that. And I've noticed at Hay, all the authors come on, they talk about their books and they get interviewed by somebody and then they say, we'll take your questions. And then it gets to about 90 seconds before the end of the session and then everyone has to ask their questions really quickly. So we're going to turn it round. Has anyone got a burning question about the news they would like to put to us right now and we can work out the answer?
This is hopefully get things going. Do you think bond markets can undermine autocracy?
Shall I take this one?
Yeah. What is your favourite Bond film? Sorry, what was your name? Oh, right, okay. Anonymous newscaster.
Finbar.
Okay, hello, nice to meet you, Finbar. Okay, let's unpack that a little bit. So obviously, when you talk about bond markets, you mean the people that buy and sell government debt on the international markets that allow governments to fund themselves. And when you're talking about autocracy, that's where Anne's the expert. That's regimes that are non-democratic, don't have freedom of speech, don't have free and fair elections. And is what you're getting at, is there a way that actually where kind of maybe democratic governments can't do things about autocracies, maybe the financial markets can? Is that what you're getting at with your question? Yeah. Anne, what's your...
Can I intervene? Because I think the question might be more specific. So we've just had in the United States an example of a very ugly piece of policy, this Trump's fairly random tariff policy, be stopped by bond markets. In other words, he made the statement where he was putting tariffs on everybody all over the world, and what began to happen was suddenly people got nervous about the U.S. financial system, and they stopped wanting to buy U.S. debt, and the bond markets went up, and he had to pull back on his tariffs. And there's a famous quote dating back to the Clinton administration, when Bill Clinton once said in his next life he would like to come back as the bond market because then you get to decide everything. And this quote was much repeated after this little incident. But what I think it shows is that there are limits to fiscal irresponsibility because sooner or later the markets will stop you. And I think actually the answer is sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Sorry.
So presumably the markets, as they are, aren't doing this because of some sort of political ideology. They're doing it because of a financial interest, right? It's not like they're going out to deliberately stop an autocratic regime. They're responding because they want more money.
They can respond to evidence of fiscal irresponsibility, and they can effectively block that when they perceive it.
But if we sort of move it away from the US and talk about a lot of the regimes you look at in your book, Anne, I mean, they sometimes try and kind of create their own parallel financial systems, don't they, to get around things like sanctions and, not having to finance themselves on the bond markets.
Right. So this is and this is maybe another way to answer the same question, which is, most of us, I think probably pretty much everyone in this tent, I was going to say in this room, but it's not really a room, is it? Everybody in this tent, you probably all live in a world where you pay taxes, you own your house in your own name. If you run a business, it's also under your own name. Maybe you even advertise it under your own name. In addition to that, there's a parallel financial system where people seek to hide their money from tax authorities, where they keep it in shell companies that are anonymous, and they buy property through those shell companies so that it's anonymous, so that if they own a house in central London, no one knows who the real owner is. And this is this kind of parallel system that facilitates money laundering and tax evasion and so on. And it is one of the things that has facilitated autocracy. So one of the reasons why autocratic states have done well, one of several reasons over the last couple of decades, is because it's become very easy for people to, in Russia or in Kazakhstan, to take money from the state, to launder it through the financial system, to keep it in various places, and then to use it to exercise power at home. And so one of the arguments in my book is that we should end this.
Marcus, was that what you were going to say?
It's very similar, yes. I mean, I'd have done it rather quicker, but no disrespect.
Sorry.
And because we hear that London has been known as the laundry. Is it still the laundry for a lot of that sort of stuff?
It was for a long time. It's a little better. The rules have been pushing in the right direction slowly. It's actually one of my hopes that this government will be more active on it, partly because I think Keir Starmer used to work on some of these issues in one of his many previous lives. But I mean, in the U.S., it's going the other way. The Biden administration was pushing back against anonymous companies, and now the Trump administration has said they're not going to enforce the law that was passed previously. So now they're going to make it easier.
And Anne, just that word autocrat, I mean, is there like one definition of who an autocrat is?
I mean, the definition I use is it's a political system. It can be a one-man dictatorship, or it can be a party, either one, where the rulers rule without checks and balances, or they seek to. So no other political institutions can block them. No independent courts, no independent media, no transparency, no accountability. They essentially are able to do what they want, and they aren't restricted in any way. And there are many different degrees of this. I mean, there are complete police states where there are clear autocracies, and then there are states that are more sort of halfway, where there are some balances, and then there are leaders of democracies who seek to have more autocratic power. And so there's a kind of spectrum. It's not really one system.
Right, let's have another question, but maybe we should go over this side. Are there any hands on this side?
Good morning. My name is John. Am I allowed to ask a question about Trump, President Trump?
Yeah?
So
He's not here. Guys, we've got a real VIP guest that we haven't yet.
So his latest statement, I think, in connection with President Putin, is more or less to the effect that he's totally crazy. And I'm just wondering, is this a case of the kettle calling the pot black?
Right, well, so I'm glad you mentioned this, because when we were...
Funny you should mention it,
Yeah,
actually.
because we did actually want to cover today's news, and that's actually that's one of the top stories on the BBC. And this is this latest post from Donald Trump. He put it on Trump Social. He says, "I've always had a very good relationship with Vladimir Putin of Russia, but something has happened to him. He's gone absolutely crazy. He's needlessly killing a lot of people, and I'm not just talking about soldiers. Missiles and drones are being shot into cities in Ukraine for no reason whatsoever. I've always said he wants all of Ukraine, not just a piece of it, and maybe that's proving to be right. But if he does, it would lead to the downfall of Russia." And then inevitably, he has a bit of a go at President Zelensky too. And this is in reaction to this big drone strike overnight by Russia onto Ukraine, which I think is the biggest aerial bombardment since the invasion in 2022.
And he didn't just put it on Truth Social. He also said something quite similar to reporters as well, President Trump this is. But it's definitely worth noting the footnote in that, which he continued his criticism of President Zelensky alongside that criticism of Putin, which is kind of speaks, Anne, I guess, to where we are at with President Trump on this right now.
Right.
It's so unexpected. No one could have known this was going to happen.
He's here.
He's like, he's in
No
the
one
room.
could have known.
He's in the room.
I've known Vladimir for a long time, and my guess, I don't know, maybe he isn't sleeping. I'll give him a call. We don't know. But
Actually-
Zelensky's to blame. That's what's happening.
I want to do a forensic analysis of well, yeah. I want to do a forensic analysis of how you do a good Donald Trump impression, because it is quite a good party trick. But let's do a forensic analysis of that Truth Social post with Anne first. What's going on in that message? Is that Trump actually starting to be a bit more critical of Putin, which he's not really done before?
No.
Okay.
No. So what interests me about that post is something even deeper, which is that Trump really is someone who thinks that he can create an alternate reality, another world in which there are different facts, alternative facts, as we have been saying, and make it real. And I think he genuinely believed that when he came to office, simply by being president and being friends with Vladimir, that he would bring an end to the war, and that was enough. And without knowing any of the background or any of the history, or actually really paying very close attention to anything that had happened in the war up until now, he thought that would simply be enough to end it. And now what we're seeing is reality kind of coming into conflict with his world of imagination. And he's trying to explain it and justify it. I mean, the idea that this attack represents something new, that suddenly Vladimir has gone crazy, means that he hasn't paid attention to anything that's happened in the last decade. Or just isn't interested.
But do you think that response from President Trump was as a consequence of the attack, or is he expressing really what is his frustration at Vladimir Putin? Because this attack obviously comes on the back of a 2-hour phone call between Trump and Putin, when Trump came out the back of it and said, we're going to enter ceasefire negotiations immediately.
Yeah, but the only person on the planet who thought that phone call meant we were going to enter ceasefire negotiations was Donald Trump. I just coincidentally, I was in Ukraine last weekend, and I was in a room much like this one, and it was a room full of journalists and editors in Lviv, in Western Ukraine, and I asked people in the room, how many of you believe there will be a ceasefire? And nobody raised their hand, and some people laughed. And I didn't find over several days in Ukraine anyone who thinks there will be a ceasefire. The Russians haven't said they want a ceasefire. Putin hasn't changed his objectives. He's never said he wants peace. It's all what we're all reacting to is Trump acting like there's going to be something will change, and therefore people think, well, American president says it must be true, but actually there's no evidence on the ground at all. And so what you're watching in posts like that one is this clash, as I say, between this imaginary world that we all now partly live in and reality.
But this is so interesting because on Newscast every day we're talking about the latest twists and turns in the negotiations, or the negotiations between the Americans and the Ukrainians, or what Zelensky is proposing, or what Marco Rubio is willing to accept. What should we do as journalists covering that? Should we just ignore it because it's not real?
Take a step back and say, is there evidence that the Russians want a ceasefire? Have they ever said they want a ceasefire? Are they acting on the battlefield like they want a ceasefire? And so, before covering negotiations, the negotiations between America and Ukraine, for example, as if those were creating some reality. Somebody once said the way you have to cover the news now is with a truth sandwich. In other words, you say something that's true, like, okay, the war is not ending. And then you explain, but here's what President Trump says about the war. And he says it is ending. And then you finish by saying again, but we'd just like to remind you once again, the war is not ending. So you have to keep reminding people that what the president is saying doesn't reflect reality.
Truth sandwiches available at lunchtime here in Hay. David, I know one of your themes about is that people need to be a bit more honest about uncertainty and maybe a bit less certain. And actually, Trump saying he could end the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 24 hours, that's an example of somebody not accepting any uncertainty, is it? That's somebody being too certain.
Yeah, a very extreme example. And I think, basically people can spot that quite quickly. But actually, a lot of people, and politicians in particular, are just too confident and too certain, which makes them, in my language, untrustworthy, because part of being trustworthy is acknowledging what you don't know. And there's a lot we don't know. We live in a world of ignorance, in fact. And we can be confident about the conclusions, what we're going to do in our decisions. We can say, I really feel this is the right thing. And that's all right. That's all right. But to claim confidence or over certainty about facts, about what is going to happen or what is the case, is really unreliable, and we should be spotting that and calling it out. And I think so this is right across the political spectrum. Politicians find it very difficult to acknowledge their uncertainty.
Yeah, the only problem is that, and I know this from my own experience, but also from watching people in public life, is that nuance at the moment plays very badly. So if you're a politician, you go on TV and you say, well, on the one hand, this could be true, but then there's also this counter evidence, and therefore I'm going to weave a little bit and offer you a nuanced and complex explanation. People turn off the television or say we don't believe this person.
That may be the case. There's no excuse, though, I think, is just to fit in, though, to then go to a polarized extreme of stating an overconfidence about one side or another. No. We saw that during COVID, that people, the middle ground, actually, especially in America, people went to one end or the other, and this was completely disastrous. So the fact that some people may turn off their televisions, if you are trying to be trustworthy, is no excuse not to be trustworthy. In a sense, you've got to do it.
No, it's very difficult. I mean, we live in a world in which what is favored for what plays well, especially on social media, is anger, emotion, certainty, clarity, but I mean, I'm agreeing with you. I'm not disagreeing.
But the problem is that this is judging everything by what essentially the extreme voices in social media, how they might respond to it. But we've done with my psychologist chums, we've done research on a general population about whether nuanced messages are considered more trustworthy than extreme messages. And always the nuanced messages are considered more trustworthy,
I'm sure that's
particularly among the people who are skeptical of authority. And so, when authority tries to say, oh, this is the case, and I mean, let's use vaccines. I'm not anti-vaccine. I'm jabbed up to the eyeballs, but, I still find the phrase vaccines are safe and effective actually misinformation. Vaccines are safe enough and effective enough to give to some people in some circumstances. But the problem is that authorities say, oh, we've got to say vaccines are safe and effective in order to counter the anti-vaxxers. And our research has shown that that sort of message actively decreases trust in people who are skeptical about vaccines. So you're actually making things worse.
If you take that argument and applied it, for example, to maybe like a domestic policy agenda where we know trust at the moment is low, could you say that perhaps a politician can make a statement of their action with certainty, but be more nuanced about what the possible outcome is? So, for example, to make this a sort of tangible, real-world example, the government could say, we are going to change the planning system, but what they can't say is that means we're going to get the economy growing by X% in so many years, and that's a guarantee.
Exactly, and I use as an example, communication in crises is an extreme example of that, where people are feeling very vulnerable and they're looking for someone to trust. And I always follow John Krebs when he was head of the Food Standards Agency, and he had foot and mouth and BSE, everything, absolute disaster. And he had a complete playbook when he was communicating to the public. First of all, he said what we know, and he's absolutely, this is what we know, confident. And then he said what we don't know. And then he said what we're doing about it at the moment to find out more, and this is the actions we're taking now with confidence. And then he said what you can do in the meantime, perhaps to be on the safe side. And then the final thing, which is the most important, is that he said, and our advice may change. As we learn more, we may change our opinion. And that idea of provisionality, of the fact that, we think this is the right thing to do now, but as we learn more, it may change, is the most trustworthy thing you can do, and it's something that politicians seem to find completely impossible.
Is it just politicians that are to blame for this? Because actually, if you think now, how easy is it for a politician to make a nuanced argument in the current media landscape, where you're probably going to have quite a lot of journalists ready to go, hang on, what's he saying?
Okay, we could get on. It is. It's the problem, a lot of it, is you media Johnnies,
of course it is.
who at the moment where there's some change of opinion, dance around like kids in a playground shouting, U-turn, 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 which I think is a really facile approach to nuance in decision making.
Oh, you didn't listen to last Tuesday's newscast. Oh. You didn't listen to last Tuesday's newscast where me and Chris actually fell out on air about whether the winter fuel thing was a U-turn or not. I said it's not a full U-turn, because if it's only a U-turn, if you go back to exactly what you were doing, like, we don't know where they're U-turning to.
But the BBC news item on that currently calls that a U-turn.
Well, Marcus, what do you think about this idea of a truth sandwich?
Delicious.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's a very interesting approach, isn't it? You have to be able to convey what you think is true at the time. You have to put that across in a way that is palatable to people. So a truth sandwich is a sensible way of doing it. What I find really interesting about this is that there's this sort of news seems to be pulling in different directions very hard at the moment. On the one hand, you've got social media, which is a sort of Wild West and causing a huge amount of damage. It lacks nuance, and people are incredibly tribal. You've got old world media trying to some extent to keep up with that. But then you've also got, and I'm not flattering you with this one specifically, but you've got podcasts which more and more are uncontrolled and able to do a bit of nuance and do a bit of exploring and bring people on who disagree with each other but not necessarily passionately, and really turn an idea over, which I think, apart from the fact that we probably select the podcasts that make us feel reasonably comfortable.
Reflect our views.
Yeah, I think so. But nonetheless, I do think that's helpful. I do think there's a little bit more nuance.
But Anne, an interesting point in your book, and I'd not really thought about this before, that the whole idea of hostile states sowing misinformation in places like the UK isn't just to destabilise the UK, but it's to make Russians, for example, feel that democracies like the UK aren't very good. It's as much for the Russian market as it is for the UK market.
Yeah, and here I'll add another layer of nuance, if I can.
It's a podcast. We're great for that, apparently.
So, the whole Russian disinformation, what's the point of it and how does it work? Well, one of the ways it works is that it's not as if there's a little cabal of Russians in St. Petersburg who sow, anti-systemic messages into the British or American debate, and innocent Americans and British people are overwhelmed by this fake news and don't know what to do. In fact, what the Russians understood very early, actually a decade ago or 15 years ago, was that what they would do was find what are the narratives, what are the elements of disquiet that already exist in our societies, and how can they amplify them? So, for example, they didn't invent Brexit. They didn't invent Britain's discomfort with the European Union. They just added a little amplification to it. They contributed in their way to that campaign. They don't invent Marine Le Pen. She's been in French politics for many decades, her father before her. They just lent money to her campaign, and then they help her out with social media messaging, whether not necessarily even with her cooperation. They just do it. So they look for what are the things that will undermine democracies or democratic institutions, the EU or NATO, and they work on those and amplify them. And they often have lots of help from Americans or Europeans in doing that. So it's more of a two-way process. It's not just Russians doing mean things. But you're right that it also has another purpose, because one of the things the Russians understood, and not only the Russians, the Chinese and others, again, it starts about a decade ago, which is that their main opponents, so the biggest domestic problem that they have, is people who use the language of rule of law, transparency, accountability, anti-corruption, and democracy. So people who talk like that are their biggest political opponents, because if you live in a political system where the courts are rigged and the system is unfair and very few people have lots of money, but you don't really know how or why they have money and you don't really understand how the system works, then you instinctively think we should have independent courts, we should have rule of law, this is unfair. And those kinds of movements can attract a lot of trust and a lot of energy and a lot of idealism. And so they need a way to undermine those things. And they worked out that they need to undermine them at home, but also they need to undermine them in other places. They don't, Putin doesn't want Russians to be able to say, well, we want to live like people in Europe. A lot of Russians feel themselves to be European. So instead what they need to be able to say, look, you don't want to live like people in Europe. Europe is degenerate and it's divided and it's weak. And look, they have all these extremist political parties parties and separatist movements and all these immigration problems and so on. So they understood that undermining us, as it were, was part of what would keep them in power.
Now, related to a lot of that, David, you introduced me recently to the concept of pre-bunking. Explain to me what a pre-bunk is. It's not to do with your sleeping arrangements.
Yeah, no, it's also known as inoculation against misinformation. And the idea, this has been pioneered by psychologists, such as my colleague Sander van der Linden in Cambridge. And the idea is that rather than wait for misinformation to be out there and to try to counter it afterwards by pointing out, by fact-checking and so on, you need to warn people about it, essentially inoculate them so they're ready to hear it. So you actually tell people, even before they might have heard the misinformation, you tell them about it and say, do you know there's people going around saying blah, 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 and why this is wrong is blah, 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 and this is not correct. And people nod and say, fine. And then when they hear the misinformation, first of all, they've been inoculated, they're ready to receive it, they've got the antibodies there, and they actually feel rather pleased with themselves because they say, oh, I'm not going to be taken in by that. And it's been shown, again, lots of trials, experimental studies on young people, that this can be effective and that actually empowers people and makes them feel, self-effective and things like this. So it's really good. So that idea of pre-bunking, now that's about misinformation, but actually that idea of, in a milder sense, what I like the term of preempting misunderstandings. And in my job as a statistician and conflict of interest, I'm a non-executive director of the UK Statistics Authority that oversees the work of the Office for National Statistics and so on. And one of the things that's growing, and if you read ONS bulletins, heaven help you, but if you do, if you do, you may notice in the future a growing tendency to put at the top not just the main findings of what the data is saying, but also what it doesn't mean. You cannot conclude from this data that X. In other words, trying to improve people's understanding by preempting the possible misunderstandings. And it's a very powerful idea.
The ONS, the Office for National Statistics, have been getting a bit of grief lately, particularly over their stats about the workforce, the labour stats.
Yeah, as I said, I've got a strong conflict of interest here, so it's not something I want to spend a lot of time on. But yes,
I'm just trying to get some news.
No, I know, no. I'm not going to say anything that isn't in every newspaper about the fact that, there has been a lot of trouble. ONS is not alone with finding that people don't respond to surveys, and moving to a new form of survey that's online and much shorter has taken much longer than it should have.
How did you find out that people don't respond to surveys? Was there a way of...
Exactly.
My favourite survey that I've seen recently was a YouGov poll of Americans asking them their views of the Middle Ages. I'm not sure why somebody wanted to do a survey about that. Maybe it's the History Channel or something. And something like 7% of Americans thought the Black Death was good. But then my colleague Richard, who edits More or Less and sometimes edits Antisocial, the program that I do on Radio 4 on Friday lunchtimes, he was like, he loves these moments because he then sends me loads and loads of WhatsApps to studies about how the world works. And there's basically this thing about studies that you will always find about 4 to 7% of people who do the crazy answer. Yeah. For example, there's a famous one about 4% of people say they've been decapitated when you do surveys, and it just reveals something about how people respond to surveys, doesn't it? Yeah. Right, let's do another news. I've just seen my old colleague Rory Kethlin-Jones, technology correspondent. Rory will always have the COVID app. We've spent many hours on Newscast in the previous era talking about the COVID app. Whatever happened to that? Alex, let's do another news story, which is the growing hoo-ha in the Labour Party about the changes to the benefit system, the 2-child limit in the benefit system, and this has taken on a new kind of oomph after the U-turn, partial change of policy.
Nearly good at U-turn.
I'm covering all the bases.
Your own position on the U-turn, Adam.
I'm just covering all the bases. What's your take on just like the temperature in the Labour Party about all of that at the moment?
I think this is going to be a really big issue for the party in the coming weeks, and there are 3 really specific policy points, and then there's the big picture that's going on. So the 3 specific policy points are the winter fuel, U-turn brackets non-U-turn. Then there is this argument about whether Labour should lift the cap, which means that you can only get some benefits for up to 2 children in your family. And then there is the broader changes to the welfare system, which has caused an enormous lot of unhappiness on Labour's backbenches. But the big I think, bigger picture behind all of this is, yes, you have got some Labour MPs that don't feel comfortable with some of these specific policy changes and are getting quite a lot of grief from their constituents about it, let's be clear. But then you've also got this kind of ideological split at the top of the party about how they should respond to what is going on with the economy and where they should choose to spend money. And we saw this kind of play out with the leaked memo from Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, in which she was advocating a different approach to the one that Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, decided to take at the budget last year, where Angela Rayner was effectively arguing for raising taxes on wealthy people rather than looking at reducing spending in other areas. And I think that is what is at the core of this, what is going to be, I think, quite a significant dividing line for the party. And we have got a couple of points when this is really going to come up. We've got this spending review on June the 11th, when they're going to set out how much each government department has to spend. And I think already you get the sense there are some government departments worried about what that's going to mean for them and therefore the policies that they can enact. And then, of course, the longer picture is you've got the budget in the autumn. So this is not just one of those stories where newspapers and broadcasters and journalists like us love to go, oh, there's a bit of a row. I mean, there is really a difference of opinion within the Labour Party about where they should go at this point.
Listening to the Today programme this morning, Stella Creasy, the Labour MP for Walthamstow, was on, and she was talking about the child poverty stats. And David, can you just give us some kind of rules of thumb when Labour politicians talk about child poverty and what we're really talking about here? And, for example, people talk about relative poverty versus absolute poverty.
I mean, the definition of poverty is, something it can be controversial because do you just define it? And I'm sorry, I have not rehearsed this, so I don't know. It's something to do with media.
60%. Relative poverty is 60% of the median income.
60% of the median, which is relative. So, in other words, as everybody gets richer, it should do. The median income goes up. That's the one that's halfway along the list, and so 60% goes up, and that's relative, and which sort of, unless you decrease inequality, will mean there's always the same percentage of people who are in poverty, unless you kind of bring everyone a bit closer to that median, which of course is a reasonable objective. But absolute poverty defines it in terms of an absolute level of income per year, perhaps. But relative is a generally accepted clause. But can I say something about? I mean, I'm not going to comment on what policy should take place. But just I wonder if the Labour
still no news.
No. I wonder if they've got in a way psychologists advising them, because there's this thing in psychology, behavioural economics, whatever, called the endowment effect, which says that people value enormously something they've got and don't like it being taken away, compared with how much they might value the gain of something. So if you've got, for example, a winter fuel allowance, people get really cross at the thought of being taken away. Whereas if it was a new idea and the government said, we're only going to give it people with pension credits or something, everyone would say, yeah, fine, and nobody would object to that at all. So it's this loss is valued much more than the gain. And similarly, I don't feel I should get a winter fuel allowance. I kind of wish they had a little tick box where I could tick it and say, give it to NHS Old People Services or something like that. That'd be great. Wouldn't that be a good idea? I don't deserve it. But, for example, I do feel I deserve my old age pension. I get furious when it's called welfare. I paid for that. And also, what I really love is my bus pass. I treasure it. I love waving it. I've earned my bus pass. And if some government came in and said, oh, we're going to do away for bus passes, I'd be furious, absolutely furious. And yet, honestly, it saves me a few quid a year. But, I love having it. And so I realise the endowment effect operates very strongly indeed.
But I'm guessing. Sorry, go ahead, Alex.
I was just going to say, what's really interesting about how this is playing in at the moment is that the Labour Party know that the decision to remove winter fuel payments for many, many pensioners was unpopular. They absolutely know that, which is why Keir Starmer's done his, what are we calling it? Semi-U-turn.
Tactical adjustment.
Yeah.
There you go. Tactical adjustment at the moment. But at the same time, when they're having to make decisions about within, if you listen to the government, a fairly tight fiscal situation. The other one that is this two-child benefit cap. And David Willits, who's the head of the Resolution Foundation, was making the argument this morning, which is true, which is
that's the think tank that focuses on lower earners.
Lower income families, lower middle income families. And he was making the argument that the winter fuel policy, returning that polls better than removing the two-child benefit cap. So therefore, the question becomes, how much, but his argument was removing the two-child benefit cap would have a bigger consequence on poverty than restoring the winter fuel payment. So his argument was, and it is a question for government, how much is your policy making driven by polling as opposed to the outcome that you want to achieve? And this is quite an interesting example of that.
And then the argument about Rachel Reeves's fiscal rules that you hear from Labour MPs is, why does Rachel Reeves constrain her room for manoeuvre when it comes to spending and it comes to borrowing and it comes to taxation on the basis of some calculated numbers by a watchdog who are guessing what
And
the economy is going to
forecasts.
look like
They're
in 5 years' time?
forecasts. Yeah.
So, David, just give us a way of thinking about guessing the size of the economy in 5 years' time. And okay, the OBR don't guess. They don't guess. They do a lot of crunching of the numbers. But what's a way of just thinking about it?
Oh, it's just
keep it in perspective.
I like the idea of possible futures. You envisage things that may go on, things may go well, they may go badly, and you've got a range. And this is what the Bank of England do. They don't make any point predictions about GDP or inflation up to 3 years out. They always give a range, a distribution. They used to use fan charts. They're moving away from that now.
What's a fan chart?
A fan chart is something where it's very nice. I loved it, but I think they're going to be moving away from that. But they don't give a point estimate. They say, well, we're 90% sure it's going to be in this range, and we're 60% sure and 30% sure. So you get a dark blue band in the middle, and that's the most likely thing. And then you've got a slightly lighter green band, and then you've got a very broad band, and we say, well, we're pretty certain it's going to be in this broad band. It's 3 colours, gives a lovely image of your uncertainty. The best thing about it, though, is that the final 10% probability is unassigned. It could be anywhere.
Right.
It could be, so, whoa, it's something else. I think that's so clever. So you give a probability to something else happening. So when the COVID came along and GDP dropped 25% in a single quarter, way out beyond any sort of prediction. But they said, well, we warned you. No, don't blame us. Don't blame us. It was out in that tail, and we gave 5% probability that it could be somewhere out there that some catastrophe might happen. And I really like, it's not getting out. It's not getting out of it. It's warning people to try to be resilient to extreme shocks. And in the age of uncertainty that we're living in at the moment, that encouragement to resilience can only be a good thing.
Right, on a totally different note, Marcus, your amazing Donald Trump impression. Can you teach us all how to do a Donald Trump impression? Like, what's the elements that you need to consider?
Well, you need to make sure that the words you choose are not true. Right. So that affects the psychology behind it. But I actually think that plays out in Trump's face. So when he's talking, he keeps a very small mouth.
Yes,
he's got a tight, his mouth is almost as tightly held as his tiny little hands. And I think that is to do with making sure that the sort of narrow, pissy stream of lies that pour out of his foul, puckered face that looks like the back end of a ginger cat. I think it's a lot to do with that, and his little sharp sort of teeth up there. That, remember, they only eat soft food, so his teeth are never challenged by anything, apart from what's inside him. So I think it's to do with that. A lot of it's to do for me with mouth shape, and I find it helpful as well to pull your hands in like this. Pull your hands in towards your body, and pretend that they're tiny as well.
Now, unfortunately, because we're at a literary festival in the Welsh borders, there's not a lot of MAGA voters here to provide some BBC impartiality to everyone laughing at what you just said. But you get my point.
Adam, you're apparently quite good at impressions.
No.
Apparently you are.
No.
Have you done a Donald Trump?
No, I'm not going to do.
Can you do any? Have you got a go-to?
I've got that classic thing about impressions that you can do them. I can do them sometimes quite well spontaneously, but then when someone says "do it,"
well, I'm not picking the person. You can spontaneously choose whoever you want.
I'm shy. Marcus, can you do Keir Starmer?
Well, I was going to say that I have massive respect for people who can do a really good Keir Starmer. It's sort of a bit adenoidal and kind of a bit nasal. And I did think when Trump, do you remember the first bunch of executive orders he did? He signed in a stadium with people applauding, and he was signing stuff, go, this, when are we removing this? And people like, hey. And I just love the idea of Keir Starmer being in a stadium surrounded by British people going, we've decided to keep the winter fuel allowance. And just the British people going,
But we're not telling you how we're going to keep it.
Yeah.
Right. Should we have some more questions from the newscasters who are here in the tent with us? I'll give you 10 seconds to think of a question. Right. Oh, somebody right. Hello.
Hi, I'm Hilary Williams, and I just wanted to bring things back a little bit more to our local population here. About sort of 10, 20 miles away, we've got Blanau Gwent, which was one of the area most affected by the welfare reform cuts. Some of the largest populations living with disability. But also that's very much playing, we think, into the new up-and-coming Senate elections. They're traditionally a population that hasn't voted much in the UK elections. So a couple of questions around... The understanding, I think, is that the Reform have got a good chance of getting in if they get that population out to vote. So some thoughts about how kind of media and things relates to populations that don't vote at the moment. And also, I guess, as a second question, if Reform get a big proportion in the Senate elections, which is quite possible, how will that affect the wider UK elections?
Excellent questions for Alex.
Well, I think they're massively...
And also because this is your specialist area because with any questions, you travel around the country a lot, so you're not just stuck in Westminster in the Westminster way of thinking.
Thank goodness.
And also you've spent a lot of your career as a political journalist like chasing Nigel Farage and charting his rise. So take it away.
As a political journalist, I just want to make that very clear.
Charting.
Charting, yeah. No, you're right. I think this is hugely relevant at the moment because, well, let's take the Reform point first. And the Senate elections, which are next year, are going to be fascinating, as are the elections that are taking place in Scotland. But this in Wales particularly because they've moved to a really pure form of proportional representation now. And I think the expectation, and we never will predict an election because only a fool would do such a thing, the expectation is that Reform will do pretty well. And I think if you cast your mind back to just over 3 weeks when Reform did very well in the English local elections and won outright control of 10 local authorities and became the biggest party on a number of others, and of course won the by-election in Runcorn and Helsby, what you saw immediately afterwards was the reaction of the other parties. And this is what is fascinating when you have a new party come along and suddenly start gaining electoral success. It isn't just how important it is that that party is doing well or what they do with the power they get. That is crucially important. But the other consequence of that is that you often see the other parties react when they have another, a contender, if you like, for public votes. And I think to come back to the point, this is true for the Conservatives and Labour, but to come back to the discussion that we were having earlier, and you mentioned the welfare reforms or cuts. This is what is interesting about it because Nigel Farage has already said that he would lift the two-child benefit cap and restore in full the winter fuel payment. I think the formal announcement of that we're expecting this week. But that is interesting because they are not policies that you would assume from a party like Reform UK, which many people have seen, despite the fact the party denies this, as a party of the right. So you have to ask yourself how much of that is because Nigel Farage sees an opportunity here to widen his electoral base, but crucially, how do the Conservatives and Labour, where we know they are having a very active discussion about which direction they should head in as a party, how they're going to respond to it. So in answer to the question about the Senate elections next year, of course they're going to have a direct consequence because people in Wales will choose new members of the Senate to represent them. The same goes for Holyrood in Scotland. But they will also have a consequence because if Reform UK do extraordinarily well, and if we continue to see a fragmentation of the vote, as we saw at the English local elections just a few weeks ago, and there are many people that believe the old two-party system has gone and that we're now in a multi-party system, I think that is going to have a huge impact on politics more broadly in the run-up to the general election, and you will see the traditionally biggest parties in Westminster, Labour and the Conservatives, respond. Whether people like the way they choose to respond is another matter entirely.
And I'm just thinking, like, Alex, you spend every Friday in an environment like this.
Not always a tent.
Not a tent, usually with walls.
Normally
and
a village hall. There's sometimes,
Are there things that you're picking up from the Any Questions audience as issues that maybe aren't being noted in Westminster, but you can imagine in a couple of months' time, maybe when it's the Senate elections, will become really important?
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of Any Questions is that it's a bit of a sense and balance check because sometimes in Westminster there can be an issue which everybody's just talking about wall to wall and then you go out to wherever you may be on a Friday evening to meet people and it isn't what they're naturally discussing. I think, there are always kind of ebbs and flows and the beginning of this year was really dominated, as you might expect, by people asking about Donald Trump and the consequences of what Donald Trump might do in the White House. But I think what is really important to note is that whatever's happening in Westminster or in in Washington, there are issues that matter to people in their day-to-day lives, which are constants, and they've been constants through the 3 years or so that I've done the programme, and they're things that I think that people in Westminster would do well not to forget. And that are the things that the kind of they might sound overly domestic or local, but they are about housing, they are about planning, they are about finding somewhere to live, they are about how you manage the demand for housing without ruining the area that people live in, they are about health infrastructure and transport infrastructure and opportunities for people's children. And yes, they are about the state of the roads, which people can often dismiss, but why I actually think is a really important manifestation about how people feel about their local community. And these are the things that have a direct impact on people's day-to-day lives. So the big political questions are vital, and the global political picture is obviously crucial. But I do urge politicians not to forget the things that they can have a direct impact on, which affect people's lives in the day-to-day, because they are really, really important too.
Totally different subjects. David, while we've got you, applause for any questions.
Hooray!
Love it. While we've got you, David, can you explain to me how the government is working out how much money they're giving to Mauritius to rent the Diego Garcia military base from the Chagos Islands, which they've now handed back to Mauritius?
Okay, there are two competing numbers going around. The government say the whole scheme will cost about £3 billion, and in the papers, or a couple of the papers recently, in the last couple of days, being claimed it's going to cost £30 billion, which is quite a big distinction. I'm a numbers person. I'm not a policy person. I'm a numbers person. And I think, whoa, that's a great difference to start exploring. And at the face of it, as some people have said in the newspapers, well, they're going to pay Mauritius £100 million a year for 100 years for the use of the base. And just add that up, and it comes to £10 billion. So how can they say it's only going to cost £3 billion? And I feel like saying, haven't you ever heard of compound interest? You know,
doesn't that make things more expensive?
14-year-old kids learn this in school. And the crucial thing is that it's a government rule by the Green Book, if you must know, that when you cost up projects, it has to be according to its present value. And that assumes a sort of interest rate of 3.5% going into the future. And you can do some sums, which I did on my little spreadsheet earlier. And if you have to pay Mauritius £100 million in 100 years' time, you only need £3 million now.
Right.
Because under compound interest at 3.5% interest, did you know that 3 million will become 100 million in 100 years' time? So I do recommend that we all save. So, and that's how things are costed up. That's how they have to be costed up under the law. So you're talking about £3 billion in current prices, in current value, compared with maybe 30 billion nominal expenditure over 100 years. And I thought, doesn't everyone know? Don't these papers have economic journalists who could tell the journalists, say this 30 billion is nonsense?
Maybe they've got an incentive to make it seem bigger than it is.
I wonder. Yeah.
So thank you very much for clearing that up. I will be dining out on that for the next 99 years.
It's also just a very, very quick afterthought on this. That you mentioned the Chagos Islands, and this has obviously been one of those subjects which in Westminster has been really, really commanded attention. Any questions? We've had 1 or 2 questions about it. Now, this is never scientific, but it's just interesting, because it does seem to be one of those things where perhaps in Westminster, and of course to the Chagosians and the people that it directly affects, it's a matter of huge importance, but it isn't something that we've had droves and droves of questions on through the weeks and months that it's been discussed.
Right, on a totally different note, and this is one for you, Marcus, one of my favourite things to do on a Sunday morning is to go on a video streaming website and look at the best bits of Saturday Night Live from America.
Yeah.
There's going to be a British version of that on Sky quite soon. What's your take on there being a British SNL? Maybe you don't have a take at all, which would be fine.
I absolutely have a take. I think it's hugely exciting. I think it's brilliant, and I think they'll be missing a trick if they don't give me a part. But I would have that view. I mean, actually, most people I know have submitted a tape, and also will go, oh, it's probably not going to work, because that's the British way. But
right.
Richard Osman said, and he is quite right, this is a massive spend on comedy, right? If you think back to Morecambe and Wise, the 2 Ronnies, Vic and Bob, French and Saunders, Harry Enfield, we have been brilliant at sketch comedy in the UK. Our contribution globally has been enormous, and it culturally informs loads of who we are. We talk about these things from our childhood, and the UK has largely stopped making sketch shows, which is a tragedy, an absolute tragedy. We're brilliant at it, people love them. Even when a bunch of sketches in a show are not ones that people really kind of take to, but that's fine. There's always something, oh, I love that thing, and then it becomes part of how they talk. So I agree with Richard Osman's approach to this, which is we as a country and us as an industry, comedians in the arts, should throw everything behind SNL and just go for it. Go on, smash this out the park. This is so exciting. It's brilliant. No one watches telly on a Saturday night, but it doesn't matter. In fact, I heard a great definition of SNL saying it's a wonderful show apart from the title, because comedy on a Saturday night is a bad idea on telly because people are out. Nighttime, particularly, they're out, and live is dreadful for comedy. So apart from the fact that it's Saturday nighttime and live, it's dreadful. But as a fan of comedy, I am hugely excited about it. I think it's great.
And also the fact that you can watch the clips the next day means you don't have to watch the show, but everyone can still be. Yeah.
That's the age we live in. I'm a big fan of American SNL, and I mean, just Kate McKinnon on her own, I could watch forever. Sadly, she's not in the current cast of SNL, who are also brilliant. But the fact that we can watch things in chunks like that now, I sort of have mixed feelings about, but it's pretty great. You know?
Right, we've got a minute or two left. We're at a book festival. Can I get some book recommendations of good books? Like, it doesn't have to be your own.
Yeah, well, my own. Does it have to be new books or just books I like?
Just from any period.
Oh, Confederacy of Dunces.
Right, which is
a wonderful book by, what's his name, John Kennedy Toole. It's an American book, and I've read it again and again. I think one of the funniest books I've ever read, and it's really tragic because the guy wrote it and then committed suicide. And then his mother hawked the script around publishers for years and finally got it published, and then it was a brilliant success.
Wow. Marcus, do you have a recommendation for me?
I got 3. Josie Long's new book, Because I Don't Know What You Mean and What You Don't, is an extraordinary collection of short stories, and I've known Josie for a long time, and it's really, really brilliant. Laura Bates' new book, annoyingly, I can't remember the title, but for all the men listening, read Laura Bates' books and be uncomfortable for the duration. It's worth it. We have a responsibility as men to understand what is happening in the world of misogyny and sexism, and lots of it is getting worse, and Laura Bates has been absolutely fearless in going and discovering what that looks like. And her new book, I wish I could remember the title. Please add it later on in the edit. The New Age of Sexism. Thank you. Well, hey, what was I thinking? Not asking the audience. The New Age of Sexism, and a book very soon to be published by a wonderful writer called Rachel Parris, which is called Introducing Mrs. Collins, and is effectively a sequel to Pride and Prejudice. That's coming out very soon, and all I can say with absolute certainty is she's worked very hard on it.
Yes, said a source. Alex, do you have a recommendation?
Yeah, Anne Applebaum's, because it's short and it's got a happy ending, she tells us.
Although it is still to be continued.
There you go.
Right, thank you very much for joining us for this live episode of Newscast here at Hay. We're actually doing a little bit of a summer tour, so we're going to be popping up at other places. We're going to be at the Crossed Wires Festival, which is a big new podcasting festival in Sheffield, and we're going to be on the 4th of July, which is...
Independence Day.
Yeah, do it as Trump.
Oh, sorry. The most incredible day. It's going to be a wonderful day. We're actually changing it. We're calling it Trump Day. That's what we're doing.
Okay. And then we'll be at the Latitude Festival on the 26th of July. And we're going to be at the Edinburgh Fringe for a whole week from the 4th of August.
Good luck.
So, any tips on that?
Drink water.
Barocca. And other nutritional supplements are available. Right. Thank you very much to our guests, Marcus and to David, and great to see you, Alex.
Pleasure to be here.
But most importantly, great to see all of you here in the tent. Thank you so much for making us feel so welcome.